Hello, my loves, and welcome to yet another rather impromptu episode of Strange Playgrounds. It's late, I've been at work for a long, long time in a very strange frame of mind. It's raining outside, it's beautiful actually. Love me some rain. Feels like it's going to thunder. It's very warm and humid and heavy, very potent, charged atmosphere, which I love very, very much. I've got a coffee. I'm going to make a pizza for myself very soon from scratch, and it's going to be glorious. And there's inevitably discourse going down up on the Twitters and in other social media feeds. This time, the topic under discussion, again, a perennial one, that crops up in horror circles from time to time, which is someone has brought into question the legitimacy of young people and children liking, enjoying, and being exposed to horror films. There's a particular tweet going around out there which calls basically casts aspersions upon the apparent morbidity of it and how dark and despairing and depressing it is, and so on and so forth. And as those of you who listen to this podcast and what the hell is wrong with us know, I have a particular horse in this race because I was a child that was exposed to horror from a very young age. As a result, I have to tread very carefully. It's very difficult for me to even pretend any notion of objectivity, which is problematic in and of itself, about this subject, because it is the very warp and weft of my personality and my psychology. I can't really examine it in any objective fashion, if that's even possible at all. What I will never, ever, ever say is that horrific prescribed phrase, "and it never did me any harm," because none of us are in any position to say that. None of us are in a position to say what influences did or did not do us harm, because we can't examine our states of mind in that fashion. It's impossible. It's actually impossible, because it's mind exploring and dissecting mind. Mind is both the instrument of dissection and the subject, yeah? Which makes it impossible. Neither you nor I can set apart the phenomena called mind, which, by the way, is a problematic notion in and of itself. Go and look up some of the philosophy and indeed the neurobiology that tries to define what mind actually is as a phenomena, and you'll find there isn't any clear definition. It's actually really problematic. You can't set aside the phenomena of mind and then say, yes, look, here's this thread of influence from here which has resulted in this structure or this preconception or this reaction. It's not possible to do. The most we can do is theorize and hypothesize, right? So this is really problematic for me. I cannot, in good conscience, sit here and say being exposed to horror media did me no harm as a child. Personally, I don't think there's anything we experience as children that doesn't do us harm in some degree or fashion. It's very difficult to preempt or to predict what is going to cause us harm, because children and developing minds react to things in very strange ways. Do you remember, for example, what frightened you as a kid? Do you remember things that inspired nightmares as a child, like a very young child? When I remember back to those experiences, I find the things that inspired nightmares were incongruous, really strange. They were not icons or images of horror. They were not even circumstances that anyone else would define as frightening or as horrific or as disturbing. They were entirely innocuous, but for some reason, my developing brain interpreted certain images or certain situations and scenarios, took them and made nightmares out of them. And I don't know why. I don't know why it did that. It's really strange and bizarre, and that's the way it works. That's the way our subconscious operation works. So saying, carte blanche, that horrific material or media that is classified as horror somehow innately causes harm to the children who are exposed to it is too much of a generalization. It's far too much of a generalization. What I can say with regards to my brother and myself is that it resulted, because of the way horror media was framed to us, which is it was explicitly framed and explained as fiction, as something created, as something contrived. We came to appreciate the artistry of horror more than anything else. It was very clear to us that horror films were films and that horror fiction was fiction. And it never gave us nightmares. We were never afraid of horror films as children because we grew up with them. We actually came to identify with them and with the images and the concepts to a very strong I mean, obviously, in my own case, a very strong degree, because, of course, I write it now. I create it. It's what I imagine. The result of it is that we are very much we've kind of become horror snobs in a way. We both have particular tastes and standards when it comes to horror. It's got to be good. It's got to be good. For my own personal tastes, it's got to be disturbing. I really want it. I want horror media to affect me profoundly. I want it to shudder me. I want it to do something very intense to me. What I suppose in popular parlance would be called triggering. You know, I really want it to arouse those associations. I want it to dredge up my traumas and my problems and my concerns, because that's what it's for. Insofar as I'm concerned, that's what horror is for. And it's true whether you watch it as a child or as an adult. Another thing that this aspersion does, by the way, is that it suggests that children don't have any trauma anyway, which is bullshit. There's something dehumanizing about the moral panic of it, which markets children in this very Victorian way as these vessels and scions of innocence, these unruined vessels, which I'm sorry just isn't true. From the moment we coalesce, in the womb, before we're even born, we already have our problems. We already have our genetic legacies, but for one thing, which are totally out of our control, totally beyond any kind of external influence, and which stretch back through eons of time, which already imbue us with problems we can't control, with issues, with concerns, whether they're health related or whether they are psychological. It's this notion that children don't have their own trauma is bullshit. And I tell you that as someone who didn't have a traumatic childhood at all, had a kind of a good childhood by the standards of many, but despite that was a traumatized child, had lots of anxieties and problems and concerns. Which largely were philosophical. They largely related to what I perceived in the world, not in media or in fiction, but in the world. That's another thing. Children are not idiots. Children are not fools. Children are not closed off from the world. They don't operate in these insulated little bubbles. Children will be exposed to traumas. They will see atrocities. They will see more than ever. They will see news media. They will be exposed to cultural climate, to things that are happening in the wider culture. And it will have an effect. What horror media does, whether it's directly aimed at children or not, is allows for fictional or virtual arenas and playgrounds where those concerns can be processed, where they can be assimilated, where they can actually explore and express the darker sides of their natures and of their psychologies without consequence, and where they can work through things. When horror media is at its best, it allows for that. It's a kind of waking nightmare, in the same way that fantasy is a kind of waking dream, I've got a coffee, by the way, and I'm going to have a sip from it now. As I said, this is very impromptu. Don't expect professionalism here. I'm going to drink my coffee. So, yeah, it's... I find whenever there's a moral panic concerning children, whether it's related to horror media or any media, it doesn't really matter. I mean, an obvious one in the UK at the moment is with regards to trans issues, leaving aside the fact that there are trans children, by the way, and that there are LGBTQ children. Yeah, I was aware I was gay, although I didn't even know the word when I was like 6. So, yeah. I had the revelation moment when I was 13. You know, the sort of light going on that go, ah, right, so that's what it is. That's what it is, which is a joyous moment, by the way. Leaving that aside, whenever there's a moral panic that refers to children, or whether there's a moral concern raised that relates to children, it always ironically relies upon the dehumanization of children. The moral panic itself is more harmful than whatever the moral panic refers to. It actively stunts the development of children. It places them in this position where they have to be protected from the big bad world instead of having it explained to them, instead of being exposed to it. I mean, part of that derives from the simple neurosis of adults, you know, and also the laziness of adults, the sheer ineptitude and laziness of adults who just don't want to accept that their children are complex beings and that they will experience the world regardless of what they try to do, and therefore try to simplify it and simplify their children's natures. That is it's a recipe for disaster. And I know I'm not a parent, but I work in social care. I've worked with children a lot. I work with people whose psychologies are not that different from children's in many, many respects. And it's a recipe for utter disaster. It's a recipe for disaster. Your child will express things that are outside of that remit, and if you're not prepared for it, you won't know how to handle it, and you'll react badly. You'll do damage. If you react in a moral and judgmental or insulating manner, you'll do damage. You'll harm them. You will harm their development, I'm telling you. Whether that relates to sex, whether it relates to violence, whether it relates to the evils of the world, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. If you react in that way, you will do them more harm than actual exposure to those subjects. I guarantee you. I guarantee you will. 90% of our neuroses derive from that very phenomena. This dehumanization of children that happens whenever morality enters into the equation. It's unbelievable to me. I mean, and that people can't see it. With regards to, I mean, not only that, but children love horror. Children love horrific material. Don't you remember being a child? Don't you remember being curious? Don't you remember, like, seeking it out? We all did it. Don't you remember ghost stories as a child? We loved them. We loved them. We went seeking them out. As a kid, I went looking for the purportedly haunted areas in my local area. You know, trying to find ghosts because I wanted to see them. Never did, unfortunately. I'm very sad about that, and I never have. I'm very sad about that. I would love to see something like that. Even now, I'd love to. I remember, like, doing tarot card readings and occult ceremonies and trying to conjure demons and all sorts of shit when I was a kid. Maybe I was weird, I don't know. Maybe I was an oddball, I don't really know. But children seek out these experiences generally, especially if they're not conditioned to regard them with fear, with genuine dread. All you're doing, if you're denying children these experiences, their trauma, if you're denying them their complexity as human beings, then you are setting them up for a fall later on, when they will be exposed to these things regardless. Mortality is a very good example. A lot of parents, a lot of culture is really iffy about talking to children about mortality. They use all of these hideous euphemisms and whatnot. And we actually, in care, we learn, one of the things we are told very early on is you're honest. You are honest. You don't use any euphemisms. You use the terms. You use the expressions, and you are honest about it, because it actually allows for, even if it is traumatic, even if it does cause them fear or panic or problems initially, that's legitimate. It's okay for young people to experience that and to work through it. Yeah? That's all right. The notion that children shouldn't be beings of complexity is one of the greatest disservices we do to children. And it always comes from fucking moralists. It always comes from moral quarters and from those who have political agendas who are trying to initiate moral panic for that very purpose. That too, by the way. You know, there's an insidiousness behind it, which I really... There's an insincerity behind it that I find hideous. I find absolutely repulsive. Because of the way I'm trained, because of the things I've studied, and the way I've worked, and because of how I was as a child, I don't regard children like that. I just don't. I regard children as people, developing people, as complex, as ambiguous and as interesting as anyone else. In fact, a lot of the time even more so, because they're developing and they think and experience in these unabashed ways where they seek out things and they will think and ask about things in a way that adults won't very often. When we are denying children these experiences and these arenas by which they can experience these things and explore them, we're denying their basic humanity. We are trying to make caricatures out of them. We're trying to make cartoon characters out of them. And it says a lot more about those who initiate the moral panics. It says a lot more about the parents who deny their children than it does about the children themselves. It really, really does. What it says is, A, they've forgotten what it's like to be a child, or B, they want to deny it. They've set up these parameters and these barriers in their minds whereby they want to deny it. Because they don't want real childhood and they don't want real parenthood. They want a portrait of it. They want a caricature of it, some prescription of it, which is not healthy. It's not healthy. It's something that I spoke about with Jack Graham in the latest episode, in one of the recent episodes of Strange Playgrounds, when we talked about the inability in this culture, in particular in the UK, to discuss things like developing sexual identity. It's almost impossible to have that conversation on a popular level in this culture because of the media cultivated hysteria regarding child abuse. Now, of course, that's not to say that child abuse isn't pervasive and it doesn't occur and shouldn't be addressed. Of course it should, and of course it is. It's a real problem in our culture and it needs to be tackled. But because of the way news media has taken the subject and used it to stir up this incredibly anti-intellectual hysteria, we've come to a point now where it's impossible to have a legitimate conversation about developmental sexuality and sexual identity. It's impossible to acknowledge that young people and children have a kind of nascent sexual identity, which every psychologist knows. Every psychologist, every behaviourist, anyone who's ever worked with children knows. Any parent knows. We all know it because we all remember our own experiences and our own curiosities as children. But we deny it. We deny it. We set up barriers. We set up these denials in our own minds because we want to regard our own childhoods and our own children's states as this kind of hideous Edenic delusion. And it is a delusion. I'm really sorry. It is a delusion. And if you're not giving your child space and information regarding those experiences, they're going to find them elsewhere. And that's when it gets fucking dangerous. That's when it becomes possible for actual abusers to take advantage. That's the irony. That's actually what facilitates the abuse. The fact that we're not, oh, you don't talk about that. I mean, it's amazing to me. It's absolutely amazing. These moralists who protect systems of abuse through the moral panics they initiate. It's absolutely incredible to me. But that's the way it is. That's the way it is. And often the platforms that are initiating these moral panics often then go out of their ways to protect actual abusers. Whether it's the media protecting the likes of Jeffrey Epstein, for example, or the right-wing press protecting certain politicians who are caught abusing children or young people. You know, it's absolutely incredible. The hypocrisy of it is incredible to me. With relation to horror media, There are horror stories for children. Of course there are. What do you think fairy tales are, for God's sake? There's very little in even adult horror fiction that's as horrific as some of the things that you find in folklore and oral tradition and classical fairy tales. Go and read the Brothers Grimm. Sincerely, go and read it. Most people, the stories of the Brothers Grimm are one of those things that people think they know because they've seen cartoons of it, because they've seen like watered down versions of them. No, go and read the book. Go and read the books. Translations of the Brothers Grimm are really easy to find. Really easy to find. Go and look at some of those classic fairy tales. I dare you. I double dare you. And come away from them and tell me with a straight face that any adult horror film or story is any more horrific than they are. Because I'll tell you now, they aren't. It's the notion that the classification is somehow makes it somehow verboten for children is absurd. Children have nightmares, and that's something you can't control. I know you would. These quarters, if they had any say in the matter, bloody hell, would they? Would they be that invasive? Would they be that rapine as to control the minds of children, the imaginations of children? Yes, they would. Yes, they would. There's a great episode of Black Mirror called Archangel, which actually explores this in a beautiful way. And absolutely, it's my favourite episode of Black Mirror, Archangel, because it's so pitilessly explores the relationship between children and overly controlling, moralistic, neurotic parents. It's absolutely incredible, and it shows you how much damage those parents and systems do to those children in the name of protecting them. It is so incisive, it is so brilliant, and I agree completely. I agree with the conclusions of that episode unambiguously. Unambiguously. It's a discourse that we really need to have in this culture, and that we need to, I mean, it shouldn't be like old men, I'm 37, I'm not old, I'm 37, I'm not old, it's a Monty Python reference, by the way, that's ironically showing how old I am. It's a conversation that children should be having, actually. And what I wouldn't mind doing is going into schools and initiating these conversations with children, so children can have them between themselves, because they should, and they should have the freedom and the space to do so. But in this culture in particular, they don't. They don't. They are told that it's verboten, and they are actually made to feel shame if they do start having those conversations, or if they do start having those experiences. And I'm telling you, the establishment of shame about inalienable factors of your being and of your psychological operation, that's where neurosis starts, that's where damage starts, and that's where you get cultures that are as innately neurotic and diseased as ours in the UK is.